Welcome to our program On the Move. Today we will talk about how EU member states, particularly Greece, is using illegal operations to push back asylum seekers from Europe's borders. The newspaper Guardian recently wrote that at least 40,000 asylum seekers were pushed back, and such methods are linked to the death of 2,000 people. With the onset of COVID-19, we also observe that the regularity and the brutality of pushback practices have increased. All the evidence and reports by NGOs and monitoring groups clearly show that EU is continually refusing to uphold democratic values, human rights, and international and European law. EU bodies, particularly the EU border agency Frontex, which we talk quite a lot in this program, is also accused of being complicit in pushbacks, especially at the Aegean Sea. Today, we will look at these issues with my guest, Lorraine Leete. Welcome, Lorraine.
Thank you for having me, Begüm.
Thanks. Let me first introduce Lorraine to you. Lorraine is a lawyer who has worked investigating and litigating human rights and environmental abuses in Colombia, Palestine, the United States, and Greece. She is one of the coordinators of Legal Centre Lesvos, which provides legal information, assistance, and representation to migrants arriving by sea on the Greek islands of Lesvos. Welcome again, Lorraine. I'll first start asking you with the Legal Centre, obviously. Legal Centre Lesvos is based in Lesvos since 2016, around the same time with EU-Turkey statement. So first I want to talk about the work you do, but I also want to ask about the effects of the EU-Turkey deal on refugees and locals on the islands. How did the deal also affect asylum procedures for people who are trapped on the islands?
Yes, thank you again for having me and for bringing up these issues. I think it's important to go back and look at what were the main objectives of the EU-Turkey deal when it was formed. So the EU-Turkey deal was made, actually a statement, a press statement that was made in 2016 in response to an influx of migration to Europe, mostly Syrian refugees who were fleeing war in Syria, who were coming through Greece to the rest of Europe. So the main objective of this statement was to stem the flow of migration, to stop migration to Europe and keep people in Turkey. So this deal was made with a promise to Turkey of 6 billion euros, which for the most part was used to fortify Turkey's borders, both the border of Turkey with Syria and also the border of Turkey with Greece, to prevent people from entering Turkey and also prevent people from leaving Turkey to come to Europe. So we can talk more about that, how that is played out in the Aegean Sea with the Turkish Coast Guard, the Turkish police. But I want to focus now on what happened to the Aegean Islands with this deal as well.
But go on.
So in addition to stemming the flow of migration in Turkey, a new border was created between the Aegean Islands and continental Europe or mainland Greece. So in effect, the Aegean Islands, which is the main entry point for migrants coming to Europe through from Turkey, was to the Aegean Islands. And after the EU-Turkey deal, people who arrived here were prevented from continuing their journeys, were prevented from leaving Greece to go to other European countries. And effectively, the Aegean Islands were turned into prison islands. The hotspot approach was adopted, in which camps were created where people had to stay in horrendous conditions. And I can talk about the conditions in more detail and the violations that were taking place in the camps. But in effect, people were kept here, streamlined through border procedures that were set up. A new asylum law was put into place in Turkey. And it's in the context of these changes that the Legal Centre was formed in reaction to these change in policies, in reaction to people being prevented from moving where they wanted to move and being stuck on the Greek islands, and Lesvos in particular as the main entry point of the Greek islands. So the Legal Centre was formed by a group of attorneys volunteering who we wanted to work against these policies, provide access to information to people who are arriving here from Turkey, and also document and advocate against these policies on a more systematic level. So that meant documentation and litigation against these policies. So that's in general, we've now grown into a nonprofit civil organization, although we started as a group of volunteer lawyers from across Europe.
Can you tell us more about the everyday specificities of the work you do, basically on the island, in terms of what kind of services does Legal Centre provide?
So the main work that our central objectives is providing access to information and consultation for people who are arriving here from Turkey. So we want to have a place that's accessible so that everyone, regardless of their status, their legal status, at least has information about the system under which they're subject to. So we have an open door policy that provides individual consultation to any migrant who seeks our advice. And then we also will take on cases for representation in the asylum procedure, and also then to litigate against more systemic problems, for example, with arbitrary detention, human rights violations that are happening, and different abuses of power that are happening here.
In general, maybe one last thing I want to ask about this. On the islands in general, not only in Lesvos, for the hotspot islands particularly, where refugees are detained, basically, especially since 2016, what is the access to legal aid in general? Like, are people who are, trapped in these camps, can they access legal aid to support their asylum procedures easily, or is it very, because in my experience it's quite limited, and there are very few organizations such as Lesvos Legal Centre in Lesvos. So can you also give a general framework of that as well?
Yes, there's a consistent lack of access to legal information and legal aid on the Greek islands and throughout Greece, I would say, to free legal aid. There are a number of organizations now providing legal aid, but it's never enough. Right now, I mean, throughout the years that we've been working here, of course, the population of people stuck on the islands has fluctuated, but there are times when there are 25,000 asylum seekers on the island, and maybe only 15 Greek attorneys who are working in these organizations providing legal aid. So already that there's going to be a real gap in this service. And I mean, we don't have the objective of filling this gap. It's also the obligation of the state to be providing information, to be providing legal aid on appeal, for example, which they have systemically denied to people. But we do want to try to work with other organizations and make sure there is access to information to the extent we can.
Yeah. As part of your advocacy work, you've been also, I will talk about the lawsuits, some of the lawsuits you're following that you filed. But before then, I want to ask about the Aegean Sea itself, rather than just the islands and the camps, because I did some programs prior to this one where we talked about the camps extensively. But the pushbacks and the situation at the Aegean Sea itself, we haven't been able to cover as much. So I want to ask you, for the last few years, how the situation at the Aegean Sea is and what are the specific changes that you have seen, especially since the beginning of last year?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the pushbacks, which of course is the subject of what we're talking about today, it's not a new phenomenon. There have been documented pushbacks by the Greek Coast Guard for years that have been denounced by human rights organizations, by different people operating in Greece and also in Turkey. But what we have seen since March of last year has that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of pushbacks that we've been able to document, and other organizations and media outlets have been able to document, and also systemic practices that are being carried out by multiple actors throughout the Aegean, which shows that this is a clear policy of the state now to systemically push people back. So basically since March of last year, and I can also get into a little bit of the geopolitical situation that was happening, the tensions between Turkey and Greece, which in some way I think led to the increased violence against migrants at the Greek-Turkey border. So I don't know how many people recall, but near the end of April, the Turkish government announced that it would stop preventing people from leaving Turkey to come to Greece. And of course,
end of February, yeah?
The end of February, yes, sorry. Yeah. The end of February. And remember, again, this was part of the EU-Turkey deal, was that this was Turkey's role to prevent people from coming from Turkey to Greece. So they announced that they would stop preventing people from coming to Greece. And this led to many people who'd been trapped in Turkey, sometimes for years, in horrible, inhumane conditions, unable to get legal status in Turkey. They saw an opportunity to try to reach safety, to reach Europe. And this led to an influx of people coming to the borders with Greece, and an increase in arrivals right at the beginning of March of last year. In response, the Greek government announced that it would suspend the right to seek asylum in Greece, which of course is contrary to international law and Greece's own obligations. And it violently fortified its border, particularly in the northern border and along the Evros River. And so all of this happened. It also at that time received increased support from the European Commission, from the European Union member states, who both publicly voiced their support for Greece and the right to defend its borders, and also financially continued to support Greece in what it was doing, and also increased Frontex operations, specifically in the Aegean at this time. At this time when Greece was openly and quite violently violating the rights of migrants who were seeking safety and seeking asylum in Greece. The suspension of the right to seek asylum ended after a month, but it took 1 month before even there was denouncements from other European officials, and people were stuck in Greece in very, very inhumane and cruel conditions, trapped in ports without access to basic necessities, detained in unofficial detention sites for over a month. So in the context of this violent fortification is at the same time when we started to document pushbacks happening as well in the Aegean Sea at the Evros border, which have been more widely documented over the past years, but in addition to the Aegean Sea. And just to go through some of the main practices that we were then able to document throughout the past year.
Just to interrupt you, in the Turkish media, especially after these incidents at the beginning of 2020, especially by the state media agencies, we are seeing these news much more extensively on Turkish media as well, that Greek authorities are, putting refugees and asylum seekers on these rafts and sending them back to Turkey, and the Turkish Coast Guard saving these people. So this has become a very shifted narrative of Turkish media as well, that we've seen it very often. Sorry, go on.
Yes, and in response to this, I think it's also important to note that for years it's been the Turkish Coast Guard who has been doing exactly what the Greek Coast Guard is now doing in terms of pushbacks, of apprehending migrant boats after they leave Turkey, of forcing them to return to Turkey, preventing them from seeking safety in Europe. So this is still happening. Turkish Coast Guard is still, and Turkish police are still preventing people from leaving Turkey and coming to Greece. So I think it's important to note in this context that there's different international legal obligations with each authority, but in terms of the impact on people's lives and the violence that they're suffering at the hands of authorities, whether they be Turkish authorities or Greek authorities, is the same often.
Yeah, this is important to note because I think the narrative that widely circulates in Turkish media is quite different, especially after the beginning of 2020. It's mainly focused on Greek authorities, Hellenic Coast Guard's pushbacks, rather than the responsibilities of the Turkish Coast Guard. Sorry, before I interrupted, you were saying what kind of practices are being employed by the Hellenic Coast Guard in terms of the pushbacks.
Yes, so I will mention also, it's not just the Hellenic Coast Guard, because these pushbacks, I think this is also something that has not been as widely covered in the press, is that it's not only that people are being apprehended at sea by the Hellenic Coast Guard and pushed back to Turkey, but it's also people who are arriving to the Aegean Islands who are being apprehended by the police, detained in unofficial detention sites, and then pushed back to Turkey. So I want to mention both of these practices, because I think this also shows that it is state policy to push people back after they've reached Greek territory, whether it be Greek territorial waters or the Aegean Islands themselves. But what we've seen is that across the board, when a migrant boat reaches Greek territorial water or reaches a Greek island, people, well, maybe I'll go through one and the other, but when people are apprehended at sea, if their boat is in distress, often they're left stranded for hours at a time without support, and sometimes then they are rescued by the Turkish Coast Guard, or if they're rescued by the Greek Coast Guard, we've seen that they've then systemically either they're taken on board the Hellenic Coast Guard vessels and then brought back towards Turkish territorial waters, and left in these mortarless life rafts that you mentioned. Or if the boat is damaged, and sometimes the boats are even attacked by the Hellenic Coast Guard. So we have documented many incidents where the Hellenic Coast Guard officers will attack the migrant boat, either removing the motor or disabling it in some other way, and then towing this now disabled migrant boat back towards Turkish territorial waters, and abandoning it there.
Yeah.
With no guarantee of rescue, with people having no way to call for help. And another part of that's systemic in the pushbacks that we've documented is that people's belongings are systematically stolen by the Hellenic Coast Guard. This includes phones, it includes money, it includes identification documents. And so this prevents people, one, from being able to document what is happening to them, and two, for calling for help in this situation. And lastly, it leaves people without any sort of identification when they're then deported back to Turkey, which of course puts them in an even more vulnerable position in terms of being able to access any sort of procedure to regularize their status in Turkey, or to try to hold the Greek state accountable if they no longer have their identity documents, which we can talk about more in terms of the litigation later on.
But so sorry, go on. No, I was just wondering, like, we're talking about the Hellenic Coast Guard, but of course in Mytilene, in the city center, there is this very public presence of Frontex and other European, border agencies, that several other ships that we see that are written about in the media. So what is their role at the sea while we are talking about Hellenic Coast Guard? Because in many instances, Frontex is accused of not taking action. But what is their responsibility, and what are they doing at the Aegean Sea at the moment, as a response to what Hellenic Coast Guard is doing in terms of the pushback practices?
Yes, well, as a European agency, they have a responsibility to be monitoring the borders and monitoring for any rights violations that might be happening at the borders. And in this, they are abjectly failing. We don't have any documentation ourselves from the survivors that have contacted us. We don't have any direct documentation that Frontex was actually present or taking part in the pushback, but we do know that they have a presence in the area and a responsibility to be monitoring this. There have been other documented incidents where Frontex is directly involved. But even if they're not directly involved, they're failing in their obligations to be preventing and documenting human rights violations that are happening. When we talk later about specific cases, the specific Kriti case, there's no way that Frontex was not aware of this operation because of the size of the operation, because of the area of the sea that had to be crossed to carry it out, because of the number of Hellenic Coast Guard vessels that were involved.
But it is the same around Lesvos and other islands as well. They are constantly present, and it seems like it's for certain that they are turning a blind eye to what the Hellenic, because it's a massive operation what they are doing. Even if it's a boat of 25 people or 50 people, it's still taking people on boat, putting them back on life tents, these small kind of tent-like floating things on the water. This is something that's impossible not to see, in a sense.
I mean, at the very least, they're turning a blind eye. But there also have been documented incidences where they've actually taken part in the pushbacks. So yes, for sure, there's a failure, or I would say it's likely intentional on the part of Frontex to support the Hellenic Coast Guard in what they're doing. And we can see this as well in terms of European policy towards migrants, that Greece is carrying out Europe's objectives in terms of preventing people from arriving to Europe.
Yeah. Do you think, recently Frontex has been exposed, at least in the media and within the European Parliament, there has been also ongoing discussions about Frontex's, liability on these issues, responsibility in these issues, and it's been under investigation. Do you think any of that investigation or questioning of Frontex will have any impact on what's going on at the borders, at least in the Aegean Sea?
We continue to do our work and continue to advocate because we hope that there can be an impact and a change in policies. I do think that there is a chance that there can be some pressure on Frontex. They recently pulled out of their operations in Hungary because of documentation of human rights violations at the border there. So I do think there is an opening. In addition, because of this growing public scrutiny of Frontex and also political within the European Parliament. But in general, the political climate right now, it's very difficult to see a possibility for substantive change in border policies in the near future.
Yeah. Let's get more specific then. On April 12, April of this year, the Legal Centre filed a new complaint before the European Court of Human Rights regarding pushback operations in the Aegean region by the Hellenic Coast Guard. And this even has been, the issue has been translated to Turkish and has been widely circulated by, migration studies groups within Turkey as well. And we know that this complaint is the fifth legal action you filed against Greece before the court concerning these extensively evidenced incidents of collective expulsions in the Aegean region. The lawsuit practically accuses Greek authorities with serious violence and sophisticated interagency operations to push refugees back and stop their arrival on the islands. So here I want you to explain the details of this case that centers on the incident of October last year, as far as I know, where a fishing boat from Marmaris, Turkey, was set for Italy, carrying about 200 people, was intercepted by the Hellenic Coast Guard. So, can you tell us about the details of the case and your and the court case you filed at the European Court of Human Rights?
Yes, so this incident happened between the 19th and 21st of October. As you mentioned, it was a fishing boat, people who were trying to reach Italy to apply for asylum in Italy. They ran into a storm on the second day after having left Turkey, where basically they lost all of their supplies overboard, their food, most of their fuel, their water. So they were in a state of distress. They contacted the Hellenic Coast Guard in that moment, and also contacted UNHCR. And they were instructed by the Hellenic Coast Guard to enter Greek territorial waters where the sea was calmer and the storm calms. And they were told that they would be rescued. They waited there for over 5 hours, and you can imagine this is a fishing boat with 200 people on it, packed on there. It was incredibly crowded, and people had no supplies. They had just passed a night in a storm, in distress, and they were repeatedly told by the Hellenic Coast Guard, which is actually a search and rescue vessel, was the first to approach them, and continually over the next 5 hours asserted both that there would be a larger boat that would arrive to take them to Italy, and that they would be rescued. So they waited there until 9 p.m. when it had gotten dark, and instead of being rescued, they were attacked. So these are people who'd been in distress at sea for more than a day, who didn't have any supplies, and after it had gotten dark, their vessel was attacked by men who came from different speedboats who were traveling from the Hellenic Coast Guard vessels, who mounted the fishing vessel, and they were men who were wearing not wearing uniforms. They were wearing balaclavas. Their faces were covered. They were wearing gloves. They had arms. And they started beating the passengers on board, telling everyone to get down. They were searching for the driver of the boat, and they started beating everyone, trying to find out who's the driver of this boat. And when they identified someone as who they thought was the driver, they severely beat him, and at the same time threatened the others that the same would happen to them if they tried to come back to Greece. Many people were severely injured in this attack. Everyone was severely traumatized in this attack. I mean, people we were speaking to still, they still have nightmares. They still have trauma from this event of being attacked after they were promised that they would be rescued. They were then transferred in 2 different groups onto 2 different Hellenic Coast Guard vessels, where they spend the night, most of them outdoors, again exposed to the elements, again under threat of violence. Many people also being beaten while they were on these vessels. Their belongings were again stolen from them if they hadn't already been left on the fishing boat. They were also forced to leave this fishing boat to board the Hellenic Coast Guard vessels and leave all of their belongings behind. So at this point, on one of the groups, they were told by the Hellenic Coast Guard officials that they would be taken to Greece. They would be taken to a refugee camp in Greece. So one of these groups believed they would actually be able to reach Greece and apply for asylum, and the other, they were told basically nothing. And both of these vessels were then brought near Turkish territorial waters. And again, this is a 200-kilometer journey from where they were apprehended on the south coast of Crete. And they were abandoned in these life rafts that have now become very widely publicized in the media.
These 10 ones.
Exactly. Well, they were in 2 different kinds of life rafts. Some of them were also in a different kind. But the point is they were abandoned at sea with no means to call for rescue, after having been violently attacked in this way, after having been misled to believe they would be rescued. And many of them with need of medical care when they were then finally picked up by the Turkish Coast Guard and brought back to Turkey.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I haven't then to get into the case we brought. This was basically the incident, and of course I mean, it's extraordinary in terms of the number of vessels that were involved, the logistics of it, the distance that was taken in order to carry out this pushback. But of course, this is what we've been documenting throughout the Aegean over the last year as well. And in that sense, it's the practices are the same. It's more the size of the operation that is extraordinary in this case.
In terms of the, I'm not very familiar with the forms of legal action that is taken in the European Court of Human Rights. So, what can you also give a little bit of information of what does this mean? Because it is important that these cases are taken to the European Court of Human Rights. But in what are the accusations against Greek authorities? And why is this important? And what kind of outcome can we hope to get out of these applications?
Yes, so first, the European Court of Human Rights, it's a court of last resort. It's a court that you can bring a case there only when there's no other option in national courts. And this is the case in these circumstances under which these people were pushed back to Turkey. And also in the other cases that we've previously brought over the last months. There's a few reasons for that. One, Greece still has not signed the additional protocol to the European Convention of Human Rights, which expressly prohibits collective expulsions. So a collective expulsion being the mass deportation of individuals without individually assessing their claims for asylum, which is, in legal terms, essentially what is happening in a pushback, without getting into all of the violence that is happening at the same time. So because Greece does not expressly prohibit collective expulsions, there's no way to really get at the essence of what is done to people. You can bring individual claims, maybe for assault, for example, or for denial of access to the asylum procedure, but it doesn't get at the comprehensive acts that the Greek state is doing to carry out these pushbacks. Also, many of the survivors are in Turkey, where they don't have access to courts in Greece. They don't have the documentation to be able to bring cases in Greece, often because the Greek authorities themselves have stolen their identification documents. So, I mean, for this and various other reasons, the European Court is the only option they have to try to hold Greece accountable. And again, the European Court is a bit limited in that you have to bring cases for individual violations that individual people suffer. So you can't get into the kind of collective harm that is caused by these pushbacks. But we do bring claims. I mean, the most essential claim against a violation of the right to life, that people's lives are put in danger. People are being abandoned at sea intentionally by Greek authorities. In addition, that this treatment amounts to torture, that people are threatened with further violence if they come back to Greece. They're being abandoned at sea, forced on Hellenic Coast Guard vessels, and violently forced onto these life rafts and then abandoned there. Also, the conditions of detention I didn't talk about before, but in the cases where people have arrived to Greek islands, almost in all the cases that we've documented, people are detained in unofficial detention sites, so in warehouses, in ports, on the side of the road sometimes, where they don't have access to, well, first any legal remedies to challenge their detention, which is, kind of the minimal. It's something that legally is important, but when someone's stuck on the side of the road or in a detention center, it's not what they think about. But in addition, they're being denied access to basic necessities, to food, to water, to bathrooms. And so in these conditions as well, they amount to torture.
Yeah. Over the last year or so, Greek authorities have also extensively prevented a lot of civil society groups, monitoring organizations, and NGOs. There are a lot of limitations imposed on NGOs. So you are working in a very, very constrained and controlled environment where solidarity is criminalized more and more in Greece at the moment. So can you also tell us a bit about like how your work is affected by these limitations? Because in the past years, there were quite a few organizations settled in different parts of the island where they were able to welcome arrivals or where they could monitor these operations by the Hellenic Coast Guard. But most of these seem to have been forcefully moved out of the island, and the rest of the solidarity groups and other organizations seem to be going through way more restrictions in terms of their access to refugees and asylum seekers to support them. So how does your work? It's because your work is also one of the most essential ones because it is legal aid. This is accessing asylum. So how does it affect your work on the island?
Yes, I mean there's been a move by the government in Greece over the last 2 years to restrict and control the work of organizations working with migrants in general. But with regard to the pushbacks specifically and monitoring what's happening at sea, there's been increased restrictions on our work in a couple of different ways. The first, through the COVID restrictions and restrictions on movement because of the pandemic, as everywhere in the world, it seems that the pandemic has been used as kind of a proxy to push forward the policies that were already objectives of the government from before. So in Greece, this has meant an increase of detention and restriction of movement of migrants in general, but also on the movement of people who are trying to monitor what the government is doing when it's abusing people's rights. So it's made it much more difficult to monitor what the government is doing when one can't go out from one's house, for example. But also in practical terms, what we've seen for the pushbacks is that first of all, there's been a complete denial from the highest levels of government that these pushbacks are taking place. They have been repeatedly called fake news, but also organizations who have been monitoring and reporting on the pushbacks have been alternately accused of being Turkish agents or being involved with smuggling networks. There was also an investigation opened up in Lesvos against 4 organizations who've been vocal in documenting and denouncing pushbacks in the Aegean Sea, which of course has a chilling effect on the work that we do and that other organizations do. So far, there's been no official criminal charges brought against anyone, but just the announcement of this criminal investigation does have a chilling effect on our work.
Yeah. I also want to go on a little bit about some of the legal cases that you're working on. The Borderline Europe recently reported about a trial in Lesvos on 13th of May 2021. This year, a refugee was found guilty of smuggling and was sentenced to 146 years in prison in the court of Mytilene, Lesvos. The sentence was passed despite the passengers of the boat testifying that they owe their lives to the actions of this person. And in the reports, it said the judge asked the person accused is, why did you not come to Greece by ferry or by buying a ticket? It is absurd, but there it is. On another trial where the Legal Centre was involved, again this year in April, the Mytilene court convicted a young man from Syria of illegal entry and facilitating illegal entry. Despite the arguments your organization made, he was sentenced to 52 years in prison, I assume, and he was fined financially as well. Your report notes that he could be eligible for release after 7 years, but that would mean that he would be incarcerated for the remainder time of his 3 young sons' childhood. So in the statement that Legal Centre noted, since 2014, various organizations have documented systematic punishment and incarceration of migrants that are similar to these cases. So I want to also finally talk a little bit about these cases that are criminalizing asylum seekers, particularly with accusations of illegal entry, so-called illegal entry?
Yes, I mean the charges of illegal entry is something that we're seeing being used just in the last year more systematically, and of course this is contrary to the Refugee Convention, which says that you should not be punished for seeking asylum. But the more severe criminal charges that are being brought and that have been brought for years are that of facilitating illegal entry or smuggling. So these are the charges that carry the heavy prison sentences and that are being systematically applied against whoever the government identifies as being the driver of a migrant boat. So this is the case of the individual from Syria that we represented, and also the individual from Somalia in the first case that you mentioned. So yes, these cases have been happening for years, and one of the difficulties in trying to advocate around these cases is that often the individuals don't have access to a solidarity organization or legal aid organization who will be able to give more attention to their case, because they're arrested upon arrival. They're sent to prison upon arrival, and so they don't necessarily know where to go to get that legal aid, to get that support. And often they're brought to trial, they're sentenced without anyone knowing who they are and what happened to them. So it's rare actually in the cases where someone actually is able to find us, so that we can try to bring more attention to these cases, even if they still have this horrible result. And in the case of the individual we were representing, there was a similar atmosphere in the court. The individual was asked, for example, during the court, why he didn't stay in Syria to fight for his country. There was a question as to why he didn't stay in Turkey. Turkey could have been safe for him. Of course, these are not relevant at all to the criminal charges against him, but it shows the attitude of the court, and that these convictions are serving as a proxy to punish people for coming to Europe and to deter migration from Turkey to Europe.
And these accusations, like they rend, I mean, this is, sorry for maybe I'm not well informed, but these kind of cases, I remember in our former conversations several years ago that a lot of people coming from Turkey who are Turkish citizens in the past used to go through these accusations of smuggling. And were detained and held in detention for long periods of time. And as far as I've seen recently, there is more and more of these cases. And are they because these people are asylum seekers. They are not smugglers, or they are not, aiding illegal entry of other people, basically. So this is, I assume, a completely arbitrary, random selection of people whom they select and accuse. Is that right?
Yes, this is exactly right. And I mean, what other organizations that have been monitoring these cases more closely than us have noted is that often if there's one individual on the boat who has a different nationality, they will be assumed to be the smuggler. And of course, it doesn't make any sense. The smuggling networks are not sending the smugglers with these dinghies from Turkey to Greece. They're staying in Turkey. One person has to end up driving the dinghy. Often what people have told us is whoever the smuggler is, they jump off the dinghy and go back to Turkey just a few meters from shore, or they're picked up somewhere before they reach Greek waters. So across the board, these people are not involved in smuggling themselves. They're being, as you say, arbitrarily selected, or the Hellenic Coast Guard or the police tries to identify who the driver is, and then the driver gets punished for smuggling when someone has to end up driving this dinghy to reach safety. In the case of the individual we represented, there was actually no evidence even that he was the driver. So even without evidence, based on their own assumptions that the driver is a smuggler, they didn't even have that in this case, which shows that there's just this intention to punish people and trying to use this, as I said, as a proxy to prevent further migration from Turkey.
Do you have any information in terms of data that how widely this is being done at the moment for the last year or so? Like, are there many cases of criminalization as such that you're aware of, or do you think that this is not even, recorded and controlled in a sense?
Like the pushbacks themselves, it's very difficult to monitor this because they're happening. Well, the pushbacks, they're happening with taking people's evidence of them happening, and without people being able to monitor that they're happening. And the same for the smuggling trials, because people are being arrested upon arrival and they'll be sent to pretrial detention. So it's very difficult to monitor how many of these cases are happening. I wouldn't necessarily say there has been an increase this year because, I mean, the amount of people in prison in Greece charged with and convicted for smuggling, it's one of the highest numbers in terms of different crimes that people are in prison for in Greece. So this is a problem that's been going on for years.
Yeah. Overall, I mean, the Greek authorities constantly retell that since they have come into power in 2019 with the new democracy, they have reduced the arrivals 90%, with actual rejection of the pushback accusations. But they admit that they have reduced it 90%. So in that, but we still see on and off that not every day, but there is, I think, there are still arrivals on the islands, and people are still facing very difficult and horrid conditions in these camps. So in that sense, as Lesvos Legal Center, as Lorraine, are there any few thoughts that you want to add about the recent conditions on the islands and your advocacy statements?
I mean, specifically about the conditions, nothing specific. I think you've covered it well in your other programs, but I think thinking on a more global level and the coordination of these means of oppression and tools of oppression that are being used in different ways across the world. I mean, I think lately I've been thinking a lot, of course, about what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Colombia, because they're two places that are very close to me because I've spent years living there. And you see the same tactics used. And for example, the Israeli Defense Forces have trained Colombian forces, and now these tactics are being used to oppress Colombian people. Greece just signed an agreement with Israel to an Israeli security company to train its own air force. And so as we see kind of these globalized tools of oppression being used, I think it's important also to try to organize ourselves in resisting these tools. And so I'm taking inspiration from, get emotional now, but from the resistance that's happening in Colombia that we see real results from. So
yeah. I mean, it's looking at what's happening at the moment at Morocco and Spain's border, that the authorities literally in front of the media, in the whole world's eyes, are literally pushing people back to the sea or beating them. Like, this is all well on the news, daylight in the face. And it's very frustrating to see how this has become normalized, accepted. There are protests, and there are even some officials within the EU that fight against these things, but they have become so normalized at the moment that what's happening at the Spain's borders is even not creating it. I mean, those images that we see at today must create an outrage from every single person, the violence that's over there, even though if they are not going to be accepted, but the process that's so visibly being accepted is unacceptable. It's unforgivable.
Yes.
Well, so.
No, and I think the other thing I would want to add, because it's for a Turkish audiences, I mean, I've talked about the restrictions on our work and the kind of state repression on solidarity in Greece, but of course, it doesn't compare to what our comrades in Turkey are facing. So I also just want to acknowledge that.
But I think so far, in a sense, Mytilene and Aegean have been managed to co-work together also in solidarity, and so I think hopefully it would be best to strengthen those ties as well. So thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the work of Legal Centre in Lesvos, and looking forward to seeing you soon, hopefully. Ciao. Thank you. Ciao. Thank you for everyone watching us on the Move program. Thank you and see you in 2 weeks.
Türkiye'nin sivil, bağımsız, özgür ve çoğulcu bir medya ortamına ihtiyacı var. Medyascope 20 Ağustos 2015'te bu ihtiyacı karşılamak üzere yola çıktı. Ama yolumuz uzun. Bu yolculukta bize Patreon veya YouTube'un katıl butonu üzerinden katkıda bulunabilirsiniz. Destek verin, sizinle güçlenelim.